Hey, this is Pastor Ryan. Thanks for joining us for Step 1. This week's passage is Psalm chapter 38, verses 1 through 22. Step 1 is a resource to help aid in your inductive Bible study. It's a journey through the observation step. Before watching the rest of this video, read through the passage and list some observations you think may be important to understanding it. Let's get right into the text. In the title, we see the psalm is written by David. The purpose of the psalm is for the memorial offering. What the immortal offering was is an interpretation question, but it sounds like something we'd want to check out. David begins with a petition to the Lord, asking him to rebuke him, not in his anger, nor discipline him in his wrath. The reason for this petition is the Lord's arrows had sunk into him, and the Lord's hand had come down on him. He goes on to describe his current circumstances, saying there's no soundness in his flesh because of the Lord's indignation, and there is no health in his bones because of his sin. The reason for his unhealthy state was because of his iniquities. They had gone over his head, comparing them to a heavy burden, saying his iniquities and their consequences were too heavy for him. So it looks like something has been caused by God's discipline. He's experiencing a difficult situation, ultimately caused by his own sin. Verse 5 expands on his prior statements of God's hand having come down on him, giving a personal narrative of his experiences, saying his wounds would stink and fester. He was utterly bowed down, prostrate, as he went around mourning. The reason for being bent over like this was because his sides were filled with burning. There was no soundness in his flesh. He felt feeble and crushed. He describes how he was groaning because of the tumult in his heart. We don't know if this was a physical tumult or a spiritual one. It looks like he's blaming his present situation on his foolishness, being referred to in verses 3 through 4 as his sin and iniquity. It looks from these descriptions like he's in bad shape. He continues his personal descriptions of his present situation, telling the Lord how all of his longing was before him, how his sighing isn't hidden from his sight. The Lord knows about his situation. His heart is throbbing, his strength failing him, the light of his eyes had gone from him. He describes his situation as experiencing the plague, saying his friends, companions, and even his nearest kin were abandoning him. So we see him describe how the Lord knows about his issues and his situation, and everyone else had abandoned him. Verse 12 turns to another group, his enemies, who seek his life, laying snares for him, those who seek his hurt, speaking of his ruin and meditating on his treachery. They're at this all day long. But he describes his response, giving 3 comparisons, saying he's like a deaf man, not hearing them, and like a mute man, not opening his mouth to respond. Continuing with 2 more statements connected with a conjunction, we see David's enemies speaking of his ruin in verse 12, and he doesn't hear them and doesn't issue rebukes to them. So we see David has enemies out to get him, but he's not listening to them or responding to them. Instead of focusing on his enemies, he turns to the Lord, presently waiting for him, knowing the Lord will answer. He knows the Lord will answer him because he has asked that the Lord not let his enemies rejoice over him, those who would boast against him when his foot slips, which could be soon. He says, describing his situation, that he's ready to fall. His pain is ever before him. David knows what he has to do. He turns to confess his iniquity, mentioned in verse 4, saying he's sorry for his sin, mentioned in verse 3. It appears like he's taking full responsibility for his actions, that he's repenting of his sin. But he turns to his situation, describing his foes as vigorous, mighty, and many. He says the reason for the people doing this evil to him was because he follows after good. So he's waiting for the Lord, turning to him, responding to the discipline of the Lord, even though his enemies seem great and may pounce on him. He finishes his description with a prayer of petition to the Lord, asking him first to not forsake him, then asking to not be far from him, with a final plea to make haste to help him, because David trusts in him as his salvation. So we see the final plea to the Lord for help. Broadly speaking, we see then David speaking to the Lord about his situation, going to great lengths to describe his situation, and how his enemies might like to use it against him. But he turns back to the Lord, crying out to the Lord with a final plea to help him. And that finishes Step 1 for Psalm chapter 38, verses 1 through 22. We'd encourage you to continue your Step 1 journey on your own. What observations do you see in the text? What's an important observation you think we missed in today's video? You're encouraged to use the Life Group notes to continue your Bible study journey this week. We're looking forward to processing our Bible study journeys together this Sunday at Louisville Evangelical Free Church. We hope to see you then.